Myra Brown is only 12 years old when her older cousin Jerry Lee shakes up her life.
We were all mesmerized. You knew something great was coming out of this.
And he rocks the rest of the world.
Goodness and gracious, great balls of fire!
It's the birth of rock and roll and the beginning of a roller coaster for Myra.
Jerry would kiss me. I mean, it was nice, but I was confused.
I think Jerry Lee was a predator, and Myra was an easy mark for him.
Jerry was so possessive of me, he did not want me to look another man in the eye.
She had a terrible temper, and then you combine it with amphetamines and booze, it's like pouring lighter fuel on a fire.
When the good times came back for Jerry's career, things went to hell quickly. My family moved to Memphis, Tennessee when I was 5 years old. And I cried all the way there because I wanted to stay with my mama.
It's 1949, and Myra Brown is saying goodbye to her extended family in rural Louisiana.
My daddy got a job as a lineman in Memphis.
Memphis, they say, is this sort of gateway into the Deep South. It really became this meeting point between white and black music, between country and early sort of rockabilly, hillbilly music, and African-American music, gospel and R&B. And the focal point for Memphis music at that time is Sam Phillips and Sun Records.
Myra's dad, J.W., is a bass player, and he's quick to discover that Memphis is an epicenter for a new kind of music, rock and roll.
Sam Phillips brought together many of the musicians from the South to create this new sound. He is the one who discovered Elvis Presley, Carl Perkins, and Johnny Cash. Sun Records, it's the birthplace of rock and roll.
When J.W. suffers a serious electrical accident at work, he gets a large settlement. It's the catalyst for a career change.
My daddy said, I'm going to go to Louisiana and find my cousin Jerry and see if he'll come to Memphis and we'll put together a band. He said, I've heard how great he is on the piano, how talented he is.
Only 21 years old, Jerry Lee Lewis has already been married twice. The first time when he was 16.
In the South, people got married young, that they started having kids really young, and that then they had a lot of them. That's the story of the Lewis family.
Jerry Lee now lives with his second wife, Jane, in Faraday, Louisiana.
Daddy found Jerry working at a little dive called the Wagon Wheel. Daddy went over and introduced himself and said, I would like for you to stay at my house as my guest. I'll take you to Sun Record, introduce you to Sam Phillips, and let's see about getting a contract. The phone rings, and I'm this 12-year-old kid. The man says, can I speak to J.W.? I need to get directions to your house. Jerry came in, and he was wearing a red plaid shirt. He had a haircut that was way too short because his ears stuck out. And he just looked like nothing special. But then he started playing the piano and immediately got my attention. It was like we were all mesmerized because he was just so good on the piano. My opinion changed drastically of him. His haircut didn't matter anymore.
I was 3 years old when he moved into our house. They practiced in the living room for a while, and his hands were so fast, it was just like they were in double motion. It was like he had four hands. It was just hard to believe that he could play it like that. And the man was a great musician.
Then Daddy took Jerry to Sun Records and had him audition. And that's how it all began. His first record was End of the Road and Crazy Arms. One day in the studio, my daddy said to him, "Jerry, play that Shakin' song." Because when they were traveling and doing shows, Jerry would do that song and the audience would just react like crazy. And that was a whole lot of shaking. And the first time Sam heard it, it was like, this is it, you know.
Myra has just turned 13 when her dad and Jerry fly to New York with their band to make their debut on live national television.
Mom and I were at home watching television, and you knew something great was coming out of this.
Come on over, baby. A whole lot of shaking going on.
And I guess seeing him on Steve Allen's show, he rose in my mind, you know, to a higher level.
It is safe to say that the overwhelming majority of the network TV viewing audience would never have seen anything like Jerry Lee Lewis before in their lives.
Oh, shake, baby. You can shake one time for me.
And for a young girl growing up in the South, just the notion that you would know somebody who would be on television was almost beyond imagination.
I was 13 years old. He became a little god in my mind and in a lot of people's mind at that time.
And when a whole lot of shaking hit, they went up to $10,000 a show. Now this is in the 50s, that's a lot of money.
Clearly, Steve Allen got a kick out of him very soon after he booked him to come back on.
Mr. Commotion himself, Jerry Lee Lewis. There he is.
So to get a second bite at that apple, national television, that was a big deal.
Goodness gracious, great balls of fire.
As Jerry's fame skyrockets, his marriage falls apart.
He knew what time school let out, and he would go up there. He'd say, "Hey, you want to go get some ice cream?" And he always knew I wanted to go get ice cream. Jerry and I, we would go to a movie after dinner or something like that. I thought he was being nice to a kid. I thought it was that kind of thing. You know, like pat the kid on top of the head or something. I was idolizing Jerry and looking up to him and thinking he's this great big star. What I didn't know was that he was falling in love with me.
Myra's parents had no idea that Jerry Lee was wooing their daughter. They knew the two had fun together, they knew they were friends, but it truly didn't occur to them that this older man would try to have a relationship with their child.
You know, after supper or something, we'd drive up to the A&W or whatever it is. And Jerry would kiss me. At first, I didn't know what to think about that. I mean, it was nice, but I was confused. I was like, I'm 13 years old. So it really messes with your mind. You don't understand what's going on, but you don't want it to stop either because it was you liked it. But that's how our relationship was.
Jerry never asked Myra to get married, per se. He got the marriage license by taking this older friend, I think she was in her 20s as well, to the courthouse and having her sign Myra's name to the license. Nobody questioned it. Apparently they didn't ask for ID back in those days.
And Jerry came back home. He said, "Come outside, I'm gonna show you something." So he pulled this paper out, and I looked at it, and it said, marriage license. And I looked at it, and I said, "You mean we're married?" And he said, No. We're not married. We're gonna get married." And I said, "What?" And he caught me by my arm and he turned me around and he said, Myra, I love you. And I want to marry you. And I think I just melted, I think it just, and I told him, and I said, no, I love you too. I said, but I'm still too young. This is crazy.
I think Jerry Lee was a predator. He wanted somebody he could mold into whoever he wanted. Myra was a good, dutiful girl, and so she was an easy mark for him.
December 12th, 1957 marks a crazy new chapter in 13-year-old Myra Brown's life.
We were having supper. Jerry said, Myra, you want to go to a movie? I said, yeah, sure. We got in the car, and Jerry headed toward Mississippi. And I'm going, is there a movie theater out this way? And he said, no, we're going to get married. He had found this pastor or whoever it was that was going to marry us. And I think I was in a coma. I think my eyes were like this. And I got out of the car. I had on the red dress that I wore to school that day. And we walked in this little chapel. I don't remember getting married, but I know it happened. And then these two little old ladies started throwing rice at us and all this kind of stuff. And I'm still like a deer caught in headlights. Now we've gone down there and gotten married and turned around and came right back. And we were probably gone less than an hour. The next morning I got up and I pulled my marriage license out and I left them laying out on the nightstand. And my mother's maid found them. And she handed my daddy the marriage license. And of course, he took one look at it. And my daddy went and got his gun. And he said, I'm gonna go kill that son of a bitch.
He got in the car and took off. And Jerry was up at Sun Records at that time. Mama called Sam Phillips and said, Jay's on the way and he's got a gun. Is Jerry still there?
And Sam turned around and he looked at Jerry and he said, get in your car and get out of Memphis. So Jerry took off. Daddy drives up, barrels through the front door and says, where is that son of a bitch? And Sam sits Daddy down and tells him, we can't interfere in this life decision that's been made without you.
And he said, it looks to me like they love each other. And if we charge him, he's going to prison for a long time.
Daddy calms down. And he goes back home. And he tells Mom, we really don't have any choices because it's done. And we're going to have to hope for the best and learn to live with it.
It's against the law for married women to go to school in Tennessee. So 13-year-old Myra joins Jerry out on tour.
I didn't have a suitcase. The only thing I had was this round doll case that I had gotten at a Christmas or two before. And it was like a hat box, shaped like a hat box. And that's what I put my stuff in.
The next time JW sees Jerry is on stage at a gig in New York.
Jerry goes over to Daddy and he says, I love Myra, I'll take care of her. Music starts playing and it's accepted, it's forgotten. We went out and bought a little house. Actually, we bought the first house that had a for sale sign on it because we needed a house right away. I learned how to cook and learned how to vacuum. I had to become the adult. Jerry did two things. He played music, and he loved me. He came home, he brought all the money to me, dumped it in my lap.
I mean, it was a cash business. And Myra was in charge of taking the bags full of cash from his live performances to the bank. You really are talking about shopping bags with dollar bills in them. The notion that she was a central piece of keeping the Jerry Lee Lewis business going as a young teenager, as a girl, is pretty wild.
The first few months of 1958 tick by, and Jerry's star continues to rise.
It was a time that had never happened before, never will happen again. And the reaction of the public and the audience that made me kind of gasp. Like, look at how these people are just going berserk about him.
There for a while, he was the top dog. They had the top songs in the world.
Out of all of these figures, these kings of rock and roll, Elvis was a brilliant performer. He was cute. He had this sort of angel face. But Jerry Lee Lewis could play the piano better than anyone that was a part of this whole Sun Records crew. And Jerry Lee Lewis was fun. And fun was a huge part of the birth of rock and roll.
Private Elvis Presley makes this a VIP event. But the rock and roll star, wearing medals for carbine, pistol, and tank gunnery marksmanship, is modest as can be.
When Elvis is drafted into the Army, Jerry Lee is poised to become the new king of rock and roll.
And then they booked a big tour for Jerry in Europe in May of '58.
Elvis never went to England. Elvis never formed off of United States soil. So for one of those first-generation rock and rollers to make that trip and go over to England was a big deal.
The tour will be a surefire success if Jerry will heed the advice of Sam Phillips and not do one thing.
Don't bring Myra on tour with you. Don't bring her to London. And he ignored all of that good advice. His ego, I think, stood in the way. He just thought he was untouchable.
I didn't even know that Jerry had been warned. And he said to them, either she goes or I don't. And I think Jerry intimidated him and said, don't you talk to her. Leave my wife alone.
Myra, her brother Rusty, and their mom Lois accompany the band to England.
When we got there, they were standing there at the airport and, people just wanted to see everybody, because we were the biggest celebrities there was at that time.
The press was going to come on the plane and see Jerry and interview him. So I got off, and I'm walking around in the airport, and a man comes up to me, and he says, who are you, miss? You got off that plane, didn't you? And I said, I'm not anybody. He said, well, who are you? And I said, I'm Jerry's wife. And the guy asked me how old I was, and I said, I'm 15. I figured I could lie a little bit. His face lit up like a Christmas tree, and he took off. I had no idea. I was talking to a reporter. And I'm clueless that there could be a problem. I wish that somebody would have said, if people find out Jerry's married to a kid, it ain't gonna be pretty. Myra, you're a bomb.
It's May 1958, and the news of 13-year-old Myra Lewis's marriage to Jerry Lee is about to erupt in the British press. Initially, Jerry's British fans give him a warm reception.
They were at the airport. They were out in the streets. They were in the lobby. People loved Jerry so much, they were hanging out of the hotel windows all around our hotel.
But the tone abruptly changes the following day.
The reporter followed up, figured out Myra was 13, figured out she was his cousin and that Jerry Lee Lewis wasn't actually even divorced from his second wife yet. This was a bombshell.
The next morning, the news media said, Jerry Lee Lewis is here with his child bride, Myra.
He's a pedophile, he's a bigamist, he's a liar and a fraud. There's a call to boycott the shows, and very quickly, Jerry Lee finds himself playing to half-empty theaters where people are heckling and booing him.
And they went after Jerry Lee, they went after Myra. She was in the car with her mother and her little brother. The paparazzi surrounded the car and they were shaking it so violently, they thought the car was going to be turned over.
And Scotland Yard came to the hotel and told us, we can't guarantee your safety.
They end up coming back to America, where they hoped it would blow over, but nothing blew over.
Why did you leave? Well, I don't answer those questions, sir. My manager might knock my head off or something.
That one event turned our life upside down and changed the direction of everything. Nobody wanted to be a part of this.
Were you there, Mrs. Lewis?
I was there, but I wasn't at the show.
Oh, you weren't at the shows. Oh, did you notice anything like that sort of reception?
No, it was a very good reception, I thought.
He went from making thousands of dollars a night down to making a few $100s a night. I felt guilty because of it. I didn't make it happen, but I didn't stop it from happening. And I could have, because I was the one that let the cat out of the bag.
After they came back and after his divorce was finalized, he remarried Myra so that there was no question that this was a marriage in good standing, but the damage was done.
It destroyed a man's career, but it didn't destroy our marriage. If anything, it made it stronger because we were attacked. We don't care what the world says or does. We should love each other.
Soon, Myra is overjoyed to learn that she's pregnant.
I always loved children. What I had wanted all my life was a house, a home, and a baby.
But a few months into her pregnancy, Myra is forced to leave her home.
Jerry wasn't having the income that he had, and he was the sole supporter of his mother, father, and 2 sisters. So my house got shut down, not theirs. And I had to go live with them in Faraday, Louisiana. It was not comfortable because they resented the fact that Jerry married me. It was not a fun situation to live in the house with those people. One day, Jerry walked into the room and he reached down and he picked up my typewriter and he held it above his head like he was gonna slam it down on me. And I looked up at him and it's like, what happened? And he threw it on the floor. And he said, one of his sisters, Linda Gale, told me that she was with you the other day and y'all were driving down the road and you were smoking a cigarette and flirting with a sailor. Neither one was true. The only reason she would tell him that was to make him mad at me.
But all is forgiven when Myra gives birth to a baby boy on February 27th, 1959.
Myra had Stevie when she was 14 years old, and she was thrilled. She knew she was pretty young to be having one, but still, it was what she always wanted.
Oh, he was precious. He was a sweet baby. He was a smart baby. Jerry wanted to name him after Steve Allen for giving him his first break on nationwide television.
Myra is over the moon when they move back to Memphis and her mom, dad, and brother get to meet her baby boy.
It was great because it was like I had a little brother, you know, because I was with him all the time. And, you know, she was a great mama.
In 1960, the Lewises learn that Elvis has returned to Memphis from his stint in the Army. And just like Jerry, Elvis has fallen in love with a teenage girl.
Elvis Presley was in love with Priscilla when he was 24 and she was 14. Luckily for him, he had Jerry Lee Lewis's example.
Clearly, Elvis's team learned from the disaster of Jerry Lee and Myra and entered into the relationship with Priscilla in a very different way. Waited much longer on the marriage.
Priscilla Presley was beautiful and glamorous and did her hair and her makeup and was in the public eye. Jerry Lee didn't want Myra to be anything like Priscilla Presley. Myra was only to belong to him. He didn't want other men to be attracted to Myra in any way. Jerry Lee wanted Myra to be invisible.
I couldn't wear shorts. We had a swimming pool, and he didn't want me going swimming when there was other men out there. It was so uncalled for.
Only 17 years old, Myra submits to Jerry's demands and embraces her role as wife and mother. But nothing prepares her for what happens on Easter Sunday, 1962.
Myra was at home with her 3-year-old son, Stevie, her father-in-law, Elmo, and Jerry's uncle, George, and she was going to cook dinner. And she was asking Elmo what he wanted, and he was listing some things, and said, well, we better go inside and make a list. So she asked Uncle George, would you watch Stevie? And he said, sure. And so she and Elmo went inside, and she wrote a grocery list. They went back outside.
And Uncle George was there, and Stevie wasn't. And I said, Uncle George, where'd Stevie go? He said, he went in the house with you. Well, didn't he go in the house with you? I ran in the house to look for him. And I came back out. There was this, he'd been playing with a hose. And he'd been pulling it. And I followed the hose around the house. And I looked, and the hose was in the swimming pool. And the water was rippling. And I started screaming.
Myra Lewis is 17 years old when her 3-year-old son drowns in a tragic accident.
Myra remembers almost nothing between the incident at the pool and the funeral. What she remembers is Jerry Lee picking her up off of Stevie's grave. She was lying on his grave and wouldn't leave because she wouldn't leave her child alone.
I was so heartbroken over losing Stevie. I mean, it was the most God's awful thing could happen to any human on this earth.
There were times when she didn't want to go on. She didn't know if she could live without her baby, without her child. And then she got pregnant again. And it was with the birth of Phoebe that she realized she had to stay alive.
She just unbroke my heart. You know, she made me proud and happy to have a child again in my arms that I could hold and kiss, and gave me back something that I had lost. It was a welcoming, wonderful thing that happened.
In 1964, the Beatles conquer America and transform the sound of rock and roll. By this time, unable to repeat his success on the charts, Jerry Lee has left Sun Records. At home, he becomes increasingly controlling.
No matter what she did to try to please him, it was never enough. Nothing was ever good enough.
It ripped my self-esteem away from me. One night, Jerry was coming home, but I didn't know he was coming home that night. He said, I'm hungry, you got to fix me something to eat. Okay. When a neighbor had made some spaghetti sauce for me, and I walked by him and he said, this don't taste like your spaghetti. And I said, Bonnie made it and gave it to me. And he said, what? And he picked his tray up and threw it at me.
Jerry's bad behavior continues, even when he starts making a comeback in a new genre in the 1960s.
Who's gonna play this old piano after I'm not here?
He never returns as a rock and roll star, but eventually moves into a much more straight-ahead country style.
When country music kind of became outlaw country and was more sort of open to rebellious figures, they welcomed Jerry Lee Lewis.
I started playing with him a lot and then went full time with him later on, after I got out of high school.
When Another Place, Another Time shoots up the country charts in 1968, Jerry's career is on the ascent.
Jerry went from a little bit of success to more success to really being one of the most successful recording artists in the country music community by sort of the end of the 60s.
Jerry's second chance at fame is not enough to right his failing marriage.
When the good times came back for Jerry's career, things went to hell quickly. Jerry would turn into Jekyll and Hyde. Mid-afternoon, when Jerry was gone and going to play a show that night, I'd talk to him. And he'd say things like, hey, babe, what you doing? Da-da-da-da-da. We'd just chit-chat, normal. After the show, I could get a phone call from him. Who the hell do you think you are telling me that I shouldn't drink liquor or something like this? The next morning, Jerry would wake up and call me and say, hey, babe, what you doing? Jekyll and Hyde.
Jerry Lee, while he was on the road, began taking drugs, and Myra noticed a drastic difference in him. He would just be totally out of control, accusing her of cheating on him while he was out of town, which was totally not Myra. He had no evidence whatsoever. He was just high on drugs.
I would imagine Myra feeling completely overwhelmed and confused. These were prescription pills, they were sort of like performance enhancers. They were marketed from doctors. There wasn't the knowledge that we have today. He became a raw nerve, yelling, screaming. Jerry Lee Lewis had a terrible temper and a lot of conflict, but you take all of that and then you combine it with amphetamines and booze and sleeplessness, it's like pouring lighter fuel on a fire.
Yeah, he slapped me. Yeah, he did. That's what he would do to people. He'd slap them in the face. But when he slapped me, I would end up on the floor because the force was too hard.
Then, 12 years into her marriage, Myra gets a phone call that will ultimately destroy the relationship. Jerry Lee has been living a double life.
I just fell apart. I couldn't take another day of it.
In 1970, Myra Lewis gets a phone call that shatters her belief in Jerry Lee.
The anonymous phone call was that Jerry had been seeing other women and just picking up women on the road, and it was something that had been ongoing for many years.
In fact, he had started cheating on her only 11 months after they first got married.
Myra is devastated. She runs down to her local church to seek solace.
I knelt down at the altar and I was crying so hard that I was not even able to say a word. But that was the moment of knowing without a doubt that this was not the man I was going to spend my life with. This was not what I bargained for. I think maybe in my heart I knew that it wasn't reasonable that a man goes out and plays music and drinks and takes drugs and there's women throwing themselves at him. It's not reasonable to think he's not gonna take advantage of that. But I could, because he told me he didn't. And when I realized that it was a lie. And it had been a lie for a very long time. I knew there was no going back.
Jerry is out of town. By the time he gets home, Myra and Phoebe have moved in with JW and Lois.
Jerry was continuously calling me, want me to come back to him and all this kind of stuff. And I went over to the house to get something, and I went in and I was in the den and I heard somebody going, "Get her out the window." Jerry was in our bedroom with a girl in his bed. And I walked in there and said, "Oh, no, yeah, you miss me and you love me and you want me back, right? And this is what you're doing, laying in my bed with another woman." So, I mean, I'd been gone 2 or 3 days.
He begged her to come back, but she wasn't falling for it.
And that's when she got that apartment. And I went over and stayed with her while she was staying there, and they was getting her divorced. I was asleep and I heard glass break. And I ran down the stairs. And it was Jerry. He was trying to come through the window. Jerry saw me and I said, "What do you think you're doing?" And he said, "I just need to talk to Myra so you don't talk to her coming through the window."
I was married at 13, divorced at 26. Half of my life was spent with Jerry.
The leaving, of course, was hard. She had no education. She wasn't going to have any money because Jerry Lee didn't manage money well, and whatever they had it was spent whenever he made it. She did get some child support as long as she would go beg for it. Jerry did see Phoebe on a regular basis. Myra always felt absolutely certain that keeping that relationship between the father and daughter was an important thing to do.
Myra relocates to Atlanta, Georgia. But as she starts to rebuild her life, Jerry starts to unravel. He's arrested for driving under the influence several times.
I was taking a lot of pills at the time, you know. Nobody had mentioned it to me. I said anything about it, and I didn't know that I was in that bad a shape.
Jerry has numerous weapons violations and accidentally shoots his bass player while drunk.
Just a couple of months after shooting his bass player, Jerry Lee shows up, drunk and belligerent at Graceland, smashes his car into the front gates, is yelling for Elvis to come down, and pulls out his gun and starts firing that, and then is hauled in and arrested for that. That was the next example of chaos.
That was kind of around the same time when I decided to go into real estate. I'm here by myself. I've got a child to raise. What do I want to do?
She went back to school, got her GED. She then got her real estate license and eventually her broker's license. Myra was very successful in real estate in Atlanta, Georgia.
I was in the President's Club every year. I was a $1 million producer, and I loved every second of it.
She worked for Richard Williams. She was an agent in his firm. He was a divorced man, and she admired him immensely. And after 4 years, one day, he asked her to lunch. And the sparks flew, apparently, because they ended up getting married.
Richard Williams and I were married on June 1984. He's a gentleman. He's kind. He'll do anything in the world for me. He vacuums. I have somebody I can take care of and somebody that I know is going to take care of me. And it took a long time to get to it all, but it's been what I want.
After Myra's marriage to Richard, most news of Jerry continues to be troubling.
There are a series of marriages, many of which just end in terrible and tragic or suspect circumstances. One wife dies under very sketchy circumstances that, as reporters investigate, point toward his guilt and culpability in her death. And none of this is ever in any serious way investigated or explored by the authorities.
Really, sincerely, I would like to say one more time what a great honor it is to be back in London, England. I feel like this is home to me, you know. Well, this is where I first come over and I brought my little 13-year-old cousin with me. Remember that?
He was widely celebrated. He was inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in the first class. Jerry Lee also was very distinct within that first generation of rock and roll. First of all, he stayed alive longer than the rest of them, but Jerry Lee Lewis was also in a class of his own when it came to bad behavior.
But then what's behind that is this remarkable woman who took something from that, who took something beyond just being scarred by it and, was able to turn her life into something else.
I mean, there's been so many blessings and so many good things and so much good spread through our life that you got to focus on that. I'm happy with myself right now. I'm happy with what I've got. I've learned some tremendous lessons about life. And if I had to do it all over again, I'd probably do it all over again.
It begins with a sound almost no one remembers clearly anymore, a sharp metallic snap cutting through the thick Texas night, a sound that could have been a door slamming, or a gun cocking, or nothing at all, depending on who you ask now. 20 years later, when memory has softened at the edges but fear is not, because in the early hours of August 17th, 2005, in a quiet subdivision just outside Austin, something happened that would hollow out an entire community and leave behind a question that refused to die. The streetlights were still on, humming faintly, bathing the pavement in that sickly orange glow, sprinklers ticking rhythmically on manicured lawns, the kind of neighborhood where dogs slept indoors and doors were left unlocked, the kind of place people described with one word, safe, until that word became a lie no one dared to say out loud again. The house at the center of it all looked ordinary then. Beige siding, white trim, a porch light left on out of habit, a single car in the driveway, nothing to suggest that by sunrise it would be crawling with police tape and unmarked cruisers, nothing to hint that reporters would soon be mispronouncing the street name on live television, their voices tight with excitement, already reaching for phrases like cold case in the making, already sensing the chill. Inside lived Sarah Mitchell, 34 years old, elementary school teacher, recently divorced, the kind of woman neighbors described with easy adjectives, kind, quiet, dependable, the woman who collected mail for you when you were out of town, who waved every morning at exactly 7:12 as she pulled out of the driveway, who baked too much banana bread and gave the extra away. Sarah Mitchell was last seen alive the evening before, Tuesday night, carrying grocery bags from her car, chatting briefly with someone across the street, a conversation so unremarkable no one bothered to remember the words. By the time the sun rose, Sarah was gone. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no splintered doorframe, just an empty house humming softly with electricity, the television still plugged in, the air conditioner fighting the August heat. Her purse sat on the kitchen counter, keys inside. Her cell phone lay face down near the couch, battery dead. In the bedroom, the bed was neatly made, as if she had never intended to sleep there at all. Police would later say the scene felt staged, too clean, too quiet, like someone had pressed pause in the middle of an ordinary life. The only thing out of place was absence itself, heavy and immediate, the kind that makes your stomach drop before your brain catches up. Within hours, the story spread, first by whispers over backyard fences, then by frantic phone calls, then by the low, relentless churn of the local news cycle. Missing woman. Suburban neighborhood. No obvious suspects. Reporters stood at the edge of the street, microphones angled just so, repeating the same details over and over, hoping repetition would turn confusion into clarity. It didn't. Instead, it turned fear into something communal. Parents walked their kids to school. Porch lights stayed on all night. Doors that had never known a deadbolt were locked, then checked again. Detectives arrived with notebooks already half full of questions. Who last saw her? Who spoke to her? Who might want to hurt her? The answers were thin. Sarah had no known enemies, no recent threats, no history of violence in her past. Her divorce had been amicable, her ex-husband cooperative, his alibi solid. Friends described her as cautious, routine-driven, not the type to vanish on impulse. There was no note, no withdrawal from her bank account, no sudden spike in credit card activity. This didn't look like a planned disappearance. It looked like an interruption. They searched the house inch by inch, photographing corners, bagging fibers, dusting for prints that mostly belonged to Sarah herself. Outside, they canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, flashing badges, asking the same questions again and again, hoping someone had noticed something strange, a car idling too long, a raised voice, a shadow moving where it shouldn't have been. Most people shook their heads.
It was a quiet night, they said.
Nothing unusual. Just another Tuesday. A few mentioned seeing Sarah outside around 9 p.m., carrying groceries, talking briefly with a man nearby. When pressed, they hesitated. The details blurred. Was he tall? Maybe average. Dark hair? Or light? A neighbor? Probably a neighbor. The description collapsed in on itself, vague and useless. The police dogs picked up a scent at the front door and lost it near the sidewalk. Search teams fanned out anyway, combing nearby fields, drainage ditches, wooded patches along the highway. Helicopters thudded overhead, the sound a constant reminder that something was wrong. Hours turned into days. Days into a week. Sarah's face appeared on flyers taped to telephone poles, on television screens, on the front page of the local paper, her smile frozen in time, eyes bright, unaware of the word that would soon follow her name everywhere she went. Cold case.
Not yet, but soon.
As the initial shock wore off, frustration crept in. Tips flooded the hotline, most of them dead ends. A reported sighting at a gas station that turned out to be someone else. A white van spotted speeding away that belonged to a delivery company. Every possibility raised hope, then crushed it. Detectives worked late into the night, chasing threads that unraveled in their hands. The absence of evidence became evidence of something else, something darker, more deliberate. Whoever took Sarah knew her routine. Whoever took her didn't panic. They left no mess, no obvious trail, just silence. The community watched closely, scrutinizing every update, every carefully chosen word from law enforcement. When police announced there was no sign of a break-in, people began to whisper about trust, about how danger doesn't always kick down the door, how sometimes it's invited in. That idea lodged itself deep, poisoning the easy familiarity that had once defined the street. Neighbors who had borrowed lawnmowers and shared beers now looked at each other a little longer, a little harder, searching for cracks they might have missed. Everyone replayed that last ordinary evening in their mind, wondering what they had overlooked, what they had dismissed as harmless. Then there was the neighbor. His name surfaced quietly at first, not in press releases, not in official statements, but in murmured conversations, in the subtle shift of tone when people recounted that final sighting. He lived just a few houses down, had for years. He was the one Sarah had been seen talking to, the one people trusted enough not to remember clearly. He helped with yard work. He watched pets when families traveled. He had keys to more than one house on the block, handed over willingly, without suspicion. When detectives knocked on his door, he answered calmly, surprised but cooperative, offering up his version of events with steady eyes and an easy manner. Yes, he'd spoken to Sarah. Just small talk. Yes, he'd been home that night. Alone. Nothing unusual. At the time, it didn't raise alarms. It didn't need to. The investigation was still wide open, still chasing possibilities that stretched far beyond the cul-de-sac. Stranger abduction. Crime of opportunity. A drifter passing through. The idea that the danger might be familiar was too close, too unsettling to grasp so early. So the case moved forward, methodical, procedural, every step documented, every lead logged, even as the days bled into weeks and the headlines shifted from breaking news to lingering mystery. By the end of the month, the search was scaled back. The helicopter stopped. The dogs were gone. The street returned to something resembling normal, but the silence had changed. It pressed in, heavy with unanswered questions. Sarah Mitchell's name no longer led the broadcast. It closed it, tagged with a phrase that felt like a verdict. Still missing. No suspects. Investigation ongoing. What no one said out loud then, what no one wanted to believe, was that the case was already cooling, that each passing hour without answers was another degree lost, another chance slipping away. The evidence was thin. The memories were fading. The neighborhood was learning how to live with a hole in the middle of it. And somewhere, hidden beneath routine and familiarity, the truth waited, patient, buried under years of trust, ready to turn a cold case into something far more disturbing when it finally surfaced. The days after the search officially slowed felt heavier than the days of chaos that came before, because chaos at least carried momentum, while this new phase was defined by waiting, and waiting has a way of amplifying every fear it touches. Detectives returned to the Mitchell house again and again, not because they expected something new to appear, but because experience told them that silence often hides patterns missed the first time. They re-walked the rooms, tracing Sarah's last known movements like a ritual, pausing in the kitchen where the grocery bags had been left half unpacked, frozen vegetables still in the freezer, milk souring in the fridge, evidence of a routine interrupted mid-breath. On the counter, they noticed a faint smudge near the purse, too indistinct to classify, wiped clean long ago by anxious hands before anyone realized what mattered. Every object seemed to ask the same question: why here? Why now? And how could someone disappear so completely from a place so ordinary? Interviews continued, slower now, more deliberate. Friends were called back in, then coworkers, then distant acquaintances who hadn't made the first cut. The questions shifted subtly, no longer focused on the night she vanished, but on the weeks before, searching for stress fractures in what had looked like a stable life. Had Sarah seemed afraid? Had she mentioned anyone making her uncomfortable? Had she changed her routine? The answers were frustratingly consistent. She was fine. She was happy. She was planning for the new school year, excited about rearranging her classroom, talking about repainting the guest room now that it was finally just hers. If there were warning signs, they were either too small to notice or too well hidden to find. Phone records were pulled, bank statements scrutinized, emails combed through line by line. There was nothing dramatic, no secret lover, no sudden debt, no desperate messages sent in the middle of the night. The last outgoing call from her cell phone was to her sister earlier that evening, a casual conversation about grocery prices and weekend plans. The last incoming call came later, just after 9, from a number that didn't immediately register as important. It belonged to someone local, someone already known to police, someone whose name sat quietly in the margins of the case file, waiting. Detectives noted it, logged it, but didn't elevate it yet. Calls happen. Neighbors call neighbors. In a community like this, that alone wasn't enough to ignite suspicion. Still, they asked about it during follow-up interviews, watching carefully as answers were given. Yes, he said, he'd called her. He needed to ask about a package mistakenly delivered to her house earlier that week. Yes, they talked briefly outside. No, nothing seemed off. His tone was calm, almost reassuring, the tone of someone accustomed to being trusted. It fit so neatly into the existing narrative that it slid by without resistance. As weeks turned into months, the case shifted from urgent to unresolved, from constant updates to periodic reminders that Sarah Mitchell was still missing. Billboards went up along the highway, her smiling face staring down at passing traffic, a phone number printed beneath it in bold black letters. Candlelight vigils were held on the anniversary of her disappearance, neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder in the warm Texas evening, holding flickering flames and saying the same words over and over. We won't forget. We won't stop looking. But forgetting doesn't happen all at once. It happens in increments, in the slow erosion of attention as life pushes forward. Inside the police department, the file thickened with time, not with answers, but with paper. Tips were reviewed and dismissed. Leads were reopened and closed again. New detectives cycled onto the case, reading through reports written by hands that had since moved on or retired, trying to inhabit the mindset of an investigation that had lost its urgency. They saw the same patterns, the same gaps, the same unanswered questions. No body. No crime scene in the traditional sense. No clear motive. Without those anchors, the case drifted. And yet, certain details refused to settle. The lack of forced entry. The phone call. The brief conversation witnessed by neighbors. The way the house felt paused rather than ransacked. These elements clustered together in the minds of those who knew how to read between lines, forming a shape that was hard to define but impossible to ignore. It suggested consent, or at least familiarity. It suggested that Sarah had opened her door willingly, that she hadn't sensed immediate danger. That realization narrowed the field dramatically, focusing attention inward, toward the very community that had been shattered by her absence. Years passed. New families moved into the neighborhood, unaware of the story beneath the sidewalks they walked every morning. The house was eventually sold, renovated, repainted, its past buried under fresh drywall and new memories. Only longtime residents remembered the way it used to look on that August morning, surrounded by tape and flashing lights, a symbol of safety abruptly revoked. They carried that memory quietly, mentioning it only when prompted, when another true crime story surfaced on the news and reminded them that it could happen anywhere, even here. Then, almost a decade later, something shifted. It began not with a dramatic discovery, but with paperwork, the kind that rarely makes headlines but often changes everything. Advances in forensic technology had transformed what was possible, turning fragments once considered useless into potential gold mines. Cold cases across the state were being reviewed systematically, prioritized based on solvability, the likelihood that new methods might yield new results. Sarah Mitchell's file landed on a desk once more, flagged not because it had gone anywhere, but because it hadn't. A new lead detective took it home one night, reading through it in silence, page by page, letting the story unfold without interruption. He noticed the same things others had noticed, but he also noticed the tone, the assumptions baked into early decisions, the way certain avenues had been quietly deprioritized because they were uncomfortable rather than implausible. He circled names, dates, interactions, building a mental map that placed familiarity at the center instead of the edges. When he reached the neighbors' interview transcripts, he paused longer than expected, rereading phrases that now felt rehearsed, answers that were technically responsive, but emotionally flat. The detective ordered a fresh review of phone records, this time with tools that allowed patterns to emerge where before there had only been isolated data points. The call from that night stood out again, but now it was joined by others, brief contacts scattered across weeks, never frequent enough to raise alarms, always explainable on their own. Together, they suggested a connection deeper than casual neighborliness, a rhythm of communication that hadn't been fully appreciated before. Quietly, without fanfare, the investigation pivoted. Detectives began reconstructing timelines with new precision, accounting for minutes instead of hours, cross-referencing movements with cell tower pings and traffic data that hadn't been available in 2005. They knocked on doors again, their presence triggering a ripple of unease among those who remembered the original search. Old neighbors were asked the same questions they'd answered years before, and the answers came back altered by time, softened, sometimes contradictory. Memory is not static. It reshapes itself, influenced by what we wish were true. Some recalled the neighbor differently now. Not dangerous, not overtly threatening, but intense, attentive, always there. The kind of presence that fades into the background until it's suddenly lit from a different angle. Others mentioned small moments they hadn't thought mattered before, a lingering look, an argument overheard but dismissed, a sense of discomfort they'd brushed aside because it seemed rude to distrust someone so embedded in the fabric of the street. Still, there was nothing concrete, Nothing that could justify an arrest, let alone a public accusation. The case remained officially unsolved, its status unchanged, its files still stamped with that chilling label, "Cold Case." But beneath that label, the gears were turning again, slowly, deliberately, grinding towards something that felt like progress even if it couldn't yet be named. For the community, the renewed attention reopened old wounds. News outlets caught wind of the review, framing it as a last chance, a hopeful sign that answers might finally be within reach. Cameras returned to the street, capturing images of familiar houses now older, trees taller, sidewalks cracked with age. The story was retold, simplified, dramatized, but the core remained the same. A woman vanished. A neighborhood lost its innocence. And the truth, whatever it was, had managed to hide in plain sight for far too long. As investigators dug deeper, they understood the weight of what they were facing. If the answers lay close to home, then uncovering them would not just solve a mystery, it would rupture a narrative people had relied on to feel safe. It would force a reckoning with trust itself, with the idea that danger doesn't always announce itself with violence or chaos, that sometimes it wears a familiar face and speaks in a calm, steady voice. And as the cold case stirred, warming just enough to breathe again, one unsettling thought grew impossible to ignore. The person responsible might not be a shadow on the outskirts of the story. He might be someone who had been there all along, watching the search, attending the vigils, waiting for time to do what he believed it always does: make people forget. Time, however, did not do what he expected. Instead of erasing, it sharpened. The longer the case sat unresolved, the more certain details began to glow under renewed scrutiny, like embers refusing to die out. Investigators started with what could no longer argue back: data. Old phone records were reprocessed, not just read but mapped, layered against cell tower coverage, signal strength, and movement patterns reconstructed minute by minute. What once looked like static now suggested direction. The call on the night Sarah disappeared was no longer an isolated. It aligned with a brief window of silence afterward, a gap where her phone went dark far earlier than expected for someone known to text late into the evening. That gap coincided almost perfectly with a lull in activity from the same neighbor's phone, a quiet overlap that felt less like coincidence the longer it was examined. They pulled vehicle records next, a task that in 2005 would have been clumsy at best. Now, with improved databases and archived traffic data, they could estimate routes, travel times, the probability of movement without being seen. The neighbor's car, an unremarkable sedan no one could clearly remember anymore, had been serviced weeks after Sarah vanished. Routine maintenance, he'd said. New tires. An oil change. Nothing unusual. But service records showed something else, too, something subtle. A deep interior cleaning requested out of sequence, detailed enough to raise an eyebrow, but not enough to trigger alarm on its own. On its own, it meant nothing. Paired with everything else, it began to hum. Detectives returned to the physical evidence, what little of it remained. Boxes sealed years ago were reopened under sterile lights, their contents laid out like relics from another era. Fibers from Sarah's couch. Trace material from her front door. Dirt collected from the threshold and dismissed at the time as ordinary. New testing methods were applied carefully, methodically, the way surgeons approach scar tissue. Most samples yielded nothing. Some degraded beyond usefulness. Then one result came back inconsistent with the original assumptions, a trace that didn't match Sarah, didn't match the house, didn't belong to the random chaos of everyday life. It was too clean, too specific to ignore. They didn't announce it. They didn't rush. Cold case detectives know better than to celebrate early. Instead, they built quietly, layering inference on top of fact, never letting a single piece carry too much weight. They re-interviewed the neighbor again, this time not as a routine witness, but as someone whose story needed to be walked through carefully, slowly, from beginning to end. He welcomed them in with the same calm demeanor he'd always had, the same practiced patience. He remembered the night clearly, he said. Clearer than most. He remembered where he stood, what Sarah wore, the sound of sprinklers clicking on across the street. He remembered details others had forgotten, and that, paradoxically, made detectives uneasy. Memory rarely stays that sharp unless it has been rehearsed. They listened without interrupting, letting him fill the silence. He denied nothing that could be proven, admitted to small, harmless interactions that aligned neatly with known facts. He was helpful, even friendly, asking about progress, expressing hope that the family would finally get answers. His concern seemed genuine, his voice steady. But when pressed on timing, on the exact sequence of events after the phone call, his certainty wavered just enough to register. A minute here, 5 minutes there. Insignificant on the surface, but time is everything in a disappearance. Those minutes were the difference between someone choosing to leave and someone never being given the chance. Meanwhile, detectives tracked down people who had drifted out of the neighborhood years earlier, individuals who no longer felt bound by the same unspoken rules of community loyalty. Distance has a way of loosening tongues. One former resident recalled an argument she'd overheard weeks before Sarah vanished. Raised voices carried on the night air, a man's tone sharp, insistent. She hadn't recognized the words, only the cadence, the sense of imbalance. At the time, she'd shrugged it off.
Couples argue.
Neighbors argue. Now, when asked whose voice it was, she hesitated, then named the neighbor, her certainty growing as she spoke, as if saying it out loud finally allowed the memory to settle into place. Another recalled something smaller, easier to dismiss. A knock late at night on the wrong door. A man apologizing, claiming confusion, asking if Sarah was home. It had seemed innocuous then, almost polite. In hindsight, it felt like surveillance, like testing boundaries. Each recollection on its own was fragile, susceptible to suggestion and time. Together, they formed a pattern that leaned in one direction. Still, there was the central problem every cold case faces. There was no body. No definitive moment of violence. Without those anchors, the story remained vulnerable to doubt. Defense attorneys thrive on doubt. Prosecutors demand certainty. Detectives had to bridge a gap that years had widened, using circumstantial evidence woven tightly enough to hold under pressure. They began consulting behavioral analysts, not to diagnose, but to contextualize. The neighbor's profile emerged slowly, a portrait of control masked as helpfulness, of proximity mistaken for kindness. Someone who inserted himself just enough to be indispensable, invisible because he was everywhere. The community sensed the shift before it was officially acknowledged. Police cars appeared on the street more frequently. Unmarked vehicles lingered a little too long. Conversations stopped abruptly when strangers walked by. The neighbor noticed, too. He grew quieter, more reserved, skipping social gatherings he'd once attended without fail. Some interpreted it as stress, the weight of old suspicions resurfacing. Others felt a prickle of something colder, an instinctive retreat when the walls began to close in. Behind closed doors, investigators debated timing. Move too fast, and the case could collapse under its own weight. Move too slowly, and evidence could slip away again. They monitored the neighbor's activities discreetly, noting changes, inconsistencies, moments where his routine shifted without clear reason. They checked storage units, financial records, travel history, anything that might point to a place, a moment, a mistake. For weeks, nothing broke. Then, unexpectedly, something did. A box surfaced during a routine audit of evidence storage, mislabeled years earlier, its contents never fully examined. Inside were items collected from a nearby drainage area during the original search, dismissed at the time as unrelated debris. Among them was a piece of fabric, weathered but intact, caught on rusted metal. New testing linked it not just to Sarah, but to a garment she'd been seen wearing the night she disappeared. The discovery sent a jolt through the investigation, the kind that makes seasoned detectives sit back in their chairs and stare at the wall, recalibrating everything they thought they knew. The location of the find mattered as much as the fabric itself. It wasn't random. It lay along a route easily accessible from the neighborhood, close enough to suggest familiarity, far enough to avoid casual discovery. It pointed outward, away from the safe, manicured streets, toward a place where mistakes could be hidden and time could do its work. It didn't answer every question, but it answered one crucial one. Sarah had not simply vanished. Something had been done to her. With that realization came urgency, sharp and unforgiving. The cold case was no longer just a puzzle. It was a ticking clock, and somewhere within its slow, deliberate rhythm was a person who had believed, for nearly 20 years, that he had gotten away with it. With the fabric came a shift in gravity. The investigation, once cautious and speculative, began to pull inward with unmistakable force, as if all roads were finally bending toward the same center. Detectives revisited the drainage area where the scrap had been found, this time not as a peripheral location but as a potential hinge point in the story. The landscape had changed over the years, reshaped by weather, construction, and neglect, but certain features remained stubbornly familiar. The narrow access road. The bend where headlights would briefly disappear from view. The patch of ground shielded from the main road by overgrown brush. Standing there, investigators could almost feel the night pressing in, could imagine how easily someone with local knowledge could come and go without being seen. They reconstructed the likely sequence with renewed focus, aligning the physical evidence with the digital timeline they'd been building. The phone call, the brief conversation outside, the sudden silence. The window of opportunity narrowed to something uncomfortably precise, a span of minutes during which Sarah's routine intersected fatally with someone else's intent. That intersection, they believed now, did not happen by chance. It was engineered, timed, rehearsed. The neighbor's proximity was no longer a coincidence. It was a mechanism. Pressure mounted quietly. Subpoenas were issued for records that hadn't been accessible before. Storage facilities were searched, not with the hope of dramatic discovery, but with the patience of those who know that people rarely get everything right. They found nothing overt, nothing that screamed confession. What they found instead were absences, gaps in receipts, missing documentation for certain periods. A rental locker opened and closed years ago, its contents long gone, its purpose unexplained. Each gap was another small weight added to the scale. The neighbor was brought in again, this time to a room without windows, the air stale with the residue of countless other interrogations. He sat with his hands folded, posture composed, eyes alert. The tone remained conversational at first, detectives revisiting old ground, letting him talk, watching for fatigue. They asked about the neighborhood then, how it had changed, how people had drifted apart. He nodded, agreed, lamented the loss of closeness. When the conversation circled back to Sarah, his expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something passing through his eyes before the mask returned. They showed him the fabric, sealed in plastic, held just long enough for recognition to register. He said he'd never seen it before. His voice didn't shake. His breathing didn't change. But his gaze lingered a fraction of a second too long, as if measuring what the object represented rather than what it was. Detectives noted it, the way predators note hesitation in prey. They pressed gently, asking about the drainage area, about whether he'd ever driven that route. He admitted he had, like anyone in the neighborhood, sometimes to avoid traffic, sometimes just out of habit. It was plausible. It was always plausible. Outside the interview room, the weight of years pressed down on the team. They were close enough now to feel the heat of the truth, but not close enough to touch it. The fabric suggested violence, but it didn't say when or how. It didn't place the neighbor's hands on Sarah. It hinted, accused, but did not convict. Prosecutors were brought in, their skepticism a necessary counterbalance. They asked the hard questions, the ones detectives hated but needed to hear. Could this hold up in court? Could a jury be convinced after so long? Were they building a case or a narrative? To strengthen the foundation, investigators turned back to behavior, to the way people act before and after a crime, especially when the crime remains undiscovered. They mapped the neighbor's life in the months following Sarah's disappearance, looking for deviations. He had taken an unplanned trip shortly afterward, a long weekend away that he described at the time as a mental health break. Records showed he'd driven hundreds of miles, stayed in cheap motels, paid in cash. No obvious destination. No clear purpose. It could be nothing. It could be everything. They also noted his involvement in the search efforts. He'd been present at vigils, volunteered to help distribute flyers, spoken to reporters with concern etched across his face. This, too, could be interpreted in multiple ways.
Community solidarity.
Or performance. The line between the two is thin, and it blurs further when viewed through the lens of guilt. Behavioral analysts weighed in cautiously, warning against overinterpretation while acknowledging patterns consistent with offenders who insert themselves into investigations to monitor risk and control narrative. As whispers intensified, the community fractured along familiar fault lines. Some refused to believe the neighbor could be capable of such a thing, citing years of kindness, of shared holidays and favors exchanged. Others felt a grim validation, a sense that the unease they'd buried for years was finally being acknowledged. Trust, once broken, does not shatter cleanly. It splinters, cutting in unpredictable directions. The neighbor sensed the change. He consulted an attorney, a move that was his right but also a signal, one that detectives read carefully. Communication became formal, controlled. He stopped answering questions casually, stopped volunteering information. The easy access investigators had once enjoyed was gone, replaced by careful distance. That distance spoke volumes. People with nothing to hide often keep talking. Those who feel the walls closing and grow quiet. Still, silence is not proof. The case hovered on the edge, suspended between suspicion and certainty. Detectives needed one more anchor, something tangible enough to lock the narrative into place. They returned, again and again, to the night itself, replaying it from every angle, asking what could have gone wrong for someone who believed he'd planned perfectly. Human beings make mistakes. They underestimate time. They overestimate their own control. Somewhere, they reasoned, a trace of that miscalculation remained. The breakthrough, when it came, was not explosive. It arrived in the form of a lab report, unassuming, its language clinical, its implications profound. Additional testing on the fabric revealed more than they'd hoped for. Microscopic traces transferred through contact, preserved by chance and neglect. The profile wasn't complete, not enough for an immediate match. But it was enough to narrow the field, enough to say with increasing confidence that Sarah had been in close contact with someone other than herself in that place, at that time. They requested a sample from the neighbor, framed as routine, framed as elimination. His attorney delayed, negotiated, eventually agreed under specific conditions. When the results came back, the room went quiet. The partial profile aligned. Not perfectly, but enough to matter. Enough to turn a theory into something dangerously close to fact. For the first time since 2005, the case exhaled. The cold had begun to thaw, and with it came a realization that unsettled even those who had chased it for years. If the neighbor was responsible, then the crime had unfolded not in some shadowy corner of the city, but within the fragile boundaries of everyday life, carried out by someone who knew exactly how much trust he had been given and how to use it. The alignment of the profile didn't end the waiting, it intensified it, sharpening every moment into something brittle and exposed. Detectives knew they were walking a narrow ridge now, one misstep away from losing everything they had rebuilt from fragments and time. They began drafting the story the way a jury would hear it, stripping away assumptions, testing each link for weakness. The narrative had to be airtight, not dramatic, not speculative, just inevitable. And inevitability, after nearly 2 decades, is a difficult thing to prove. They returned to the neighbor's routine with renewed urgency, not just mapping where he had been, but how he moved through the world after Sarah vanished. Co-workers were interviewed quietly, conversations held in neutral rooms, questions framed as general background rather than accusation. Patterns emerged slowly. A tendency toward control masked as reliability. A habit of positioning himself as the problem solver, the one people leaned on when things went wrong. Several mentioned his fixation on order, on routines being followed precisely, and irritation when plans shifted unexpectedly. Alone, these traits meant nothing. Together, they sketched a personality that struggled when control slipped away. Investigators compared this with Sarah's final months, searching for points of friction. Her divorce had changed her schedule, altered the rhythms the neighborhood had grown used to. She was home at different times now, sometimes late, sometimes unexpectedly early. She'd begun setting firmer boundaries, declining favors she once would have accepted without thought. A friend recalled Sarah mentioning an awkward interaction, a neighbor who'd insisted too strongly on helping, who'd lingered when she'd clearly tried to end the conversation. She hadn't named him then. She hadn't framed it as fear, just discomfort. The kind people talk themselves out of. The timeline of the night in question was rebuilt again, this time with an emphasis on behavior rather than technology. What would Sarah have done when approached by someone she knew, someone who lived nearby, someone she trusted just enough not to feel alarmed? She wouldn't have screamed. She wouldn't have run. She might have stepped closer to hear him over the sprinklers, might have followed him a short distance if he asked for help, if he framed it as urgent or accidental. The theory didn't rely on force at first. It relied on familiarity. Detectives believed now that the moment of violence, if there was one, came later, away from the house, after that initial trust had been leveraged and exhausted. The drainage area fit this model too well to ignore.
Close.
Accessible. Forgotten. A place where sound would be swallowed and light would fail. A place where someone who knew the area could act quickly, decisively, without witnesses. It was a theory that made sense of the evidence, and that, paradoxically, made it more frightening. As pressure increased, the neighbor's behavior shifted in subtle but telling ways. He sold his house, citing downsizing, and moved to a quieter part of the state. He cut ties with former neighbors, stopped returning calls, retreated into a smaller, more controlled life. To prosecutors, this raised red flags. To a defense attorney, it would be explained as fatigue, as a desire to escape the shadow of suspicion. Both interpretations could coexist, and that ambiguity haunted the case. Investigators followed him anyway, not physically, but administratively, tracking his moves through records and requests. They requested permission to search the old property again, focusing on areas previously overlooked. Beneath a shed that had been added years after Sarah's disappearance, they found disturbed soil, evidence of digging long ago, later compacted by time and weather. Excavation yielded nothing definitive, but the disturbance itself added another question mark, another reason to keep digging. Meanwhile, Sarah's family remained caught in a limbo that had stretched far beyond what anyone should endure. Each new development reopened grief they had learned to carry carefully, like something fragile and sharp. They attended meetings with detectives, listened to cautious optimism tempered by warnings. No promises. No guarantees. Just progress. For them, progress was both hope and torture, a reminder that answers might finally be close enough to touch, or might slip away again just as easily. The case crept back into the public eye as rumors spread of a potential suspect. Media coverage intensified, old footage pulled from archives, neighbors interviewed once more. Some spoke with anger, others with disbelief. The idea that someone so familiar could be responsible forced everyone to revisit their own memories, to question their instincts, to wonder how well they truly knew the people around them. The narrative shifted from what happened to Sarah to how it could have happened here, in a place built on trust. Behind the scenes, prosecutors weighed the risk of moving forward without a body, without a confession. They consulted experts, reviewed precedents, studied cases where circumstantial evidence had carried the day. It was possible. It was rare. It required precision and courage, a willingness to stand in front of 12 strangers and ask them to believe in a story assembled from absence. The neighbor's partial DNA match strengthened the case, but it also introduced complexity. Defense would argue contamination, coincidence, degradation over time. Every argument had to be anticipated, dismantled before it was ever spoken aloud. Investigators returned to the neighbor's past, pushing further back, searching for earlier incidents that might establish a pattern. They found complaints, minor and easily dismissed at the time. A dispute with a former partner. A restraining order requested but never granted. Reports of stalking behavior that lacked the evidence needed to move forward. Each item alone had faded into obscurity. Together, they suggested escalation, a trajectory that had gone unnoticed until it intersected catastrophically with Sarah's life. As the file grew heavier, so did the silence between those working on it. They understood what was at stake now, not just for Sarah, but for the integrity of the system tasked with speaking for her when she could not. They moved deliberately, aware that the final steps would define not only the case, but their own careers. The question was no longer whether they believed the neighbor was responsible. It was whether they could prove it beyond doubt, and whether the truth, once exposed, would finally be enough to break the spell that had kept this cold case in the shadows for so long. And through it all, one thought pressed in relentlessly, an echo from the night it began. Sarah had trusted someone she knew, and that trust, once weaponized, had carried consequences that rippled outward for years, shaping lives, warping memories, and leaving behind a silence that no amount of time had been able to erase. By the time the decision was made to move forward, the case no longer felt like an investigation, so much as a reckoning delayed. Prosecutors signed off on a strategy that balanced restraint with resolve, knowing that once the next step was taken, there would be no pulling back. Detectives prepared the arrest warrant carefully, every line scrutinized, every claim tethered to something solid enough to survive cross-examination. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about timing, about choosing the moment when the weight of evidence could finally tip the scale. The neighbor was taken into custody on a quiet morning, far from the street where everything had begun. There were no flashing lights, no dramatic chase, just a knock at the door and the sound of handcuffs closing with a finality that echoed through nearly 20 years of waiting. News traveled fast anyway. By midday, headlines were already forming, each one struggling to capture the shock in a single line. Texas 2005 cold case solved. Trusted neighbor arrested. The words felt surreal even to those who had lived with the story for so long. Inside the interrogation room, the air was thick with history. Detectives sat across from a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, who had believed that time would erode memory, that evidence would decay, that suspicion would soften into rumor and then disappear altogether. They began slowly, laying out the facts without accusation, inviting him to talk. At first he did. He denied everything with the same calm precision he'd always used, his voice steady, his posture composed. He expressed surprise, hurt, disbelief. He spoke of Sarah with careful respect, as if honoring her might shield him from what was coming. Then they introduced the evidence piece by piece, never all at once. The phone records, the timeline, the fabric, the partial DNA profile. With each reveal, the room seemed to shrink. His answers grew shorter, his explanations more abstract. He leaned heavily on generalities, on the idea that coincidences happen, that technology isn't perfect, that memories change. He was right, of course. But coincidence loses its power when stacked too high. Hours passed. Breaks were taken. Silence did most of the work. When the questions returned, they circled closer, probing the spaces between his statements, the gaps he'd never quite filled. They asked about control, about routine, about what happens when expectations are disrupted. He bristled at that, a flash of irritation breaking through the composure. It was brief, but it was real. The mask slipped just enough. Still, he did not confess. He didn't need to. The case no longer hinged on a moment of admission. It hinged on accumulation. When the interrogation ended, he was led away, leaving behind a room heavy with the residue of everything unsaid. Outside, cameras waited, capturing images that would be replayed endlessly, his face blurred but unmistakable, the embodiment of a fear many had tried to ignore. The idea that evil could look so ordinary. As the legal process unfolded, investigators turned their attention back to the drainage area, now reclassified as a potential crime scene. Search warrants allowed for deeper excavation, more invasive testing. They worked methodically, aware that any discovery now would carry enormous weight. For days, they found nothing. Then, at a depth measured carefully, they uncovered items that resisted time more stubbornly than flesh. A piece of jewelry, distorted but recognizable. A fragment of bone, small enough to be missed by earlier searches, preserved by soil and chance. The confirmation came quietly, delivered in technical language that couldn't soften its impact. Sarah Mitchell was dead. The discovery changed everything and nothing at once. It answered the question that had haunted the case from the beginning, but it also deepened the loss, transforming uncertainty into irreversible fact. For Sarah's family, the news was devastating and relieving in equal measure. There was grief in knowing, and a different kind of grief in having known nothing for so long. They prepared to say goodbye to someone they had already mourned, now with the terrible clarity of proof. Prosecutors amended the charges, the case shifting from disappearance to homicide. The narrative hardened, anchored now by physical evidence that could be placed on a map, on a timeline in a courtroom. The neighbor's defense team responded swiftly, challenging every step, every assumption, every test. They argued contamination, questioned the chain of custody, suggested alternative explanations that grew increasingly strained as more details emerged. The courtroom became the new battleground, its rituals replacing the quiet grind of investigation. As trial dates were set, the community once again found itself under a harsh spotlight. The story was no longer about a missing woman, but about betrayal, about how safety can be constructed on false assumptions. People revisited old photos, old conversations, old moments where they'd laughed alongside someone now accused of murder. The shock wasn't just that a crime had occurred. It was that it had occurred so close, woven into the fabric of daily life. Through it all, the neighbor maintained his innocence. He sat stone-faced as evidence was presented, as experts testified, as Sarah's life was reconstructed in careful detail. He watched as the narrative he had tried to control for years slipped beyond his reach, reshaped by others, hardened by facts he could no longer explain away. The cold case that had once felt distant and abstract now bore down on him with crushing immediacy. And yet, even as the case moved inexorably toward resolution, an unease lingered. Cold cases leave scars not just because of what they hide, but because of what they reveal when they finally surface. This one revealed how easily trust can be exploited, how violence can masquerade as familiarity, and how time, far from erasing the truth, can sometimes preserve it, waiting patiently for the moment when it can no longer be ignored. The trial did not move quickly, and in that delay there was a cruelty all its own. Motions were filed, evidence contested, expert witnesses vetted and revetted, each procedural step stretching the distance between accusation and judgment. The courtroom became a theater of restraint, its wood-paneled walls absorbing tension that never fully dissipated. Every day, reporters gathered outside, repeating the same phrases into cameras: cold case, trusted neighbor, solved after 19 years, their voices carrying a mix of awe and unease, as if even saying it out loud felt dangerous. Inside, prosecutors began to lay the story out the way it had taken shape in their minds, not as a burst of violence, but as a slow convergence. They spoke of proximity, of routine, of how crimes like this are rarely spontaneous. They showed jurors maps of the neighborhood, photographs of the drainage area, timelines compressed into narrow windows that left little room for chance. They introduced the phone records again, this time enlarged, annotated, transformed into something visual and inescapable. Each call, each gap, became a brick in a wall that had been years in the making. Witnesses followed, one after another, their testimony weaving together past and present. Former neighbors took the stand, voices unsteady as they described memories they had tried not to revisit. They spoke of seeing Sarah that night, of small interactions that had seemed meaningless at the time. Some admitted their guilt, their shame at not having noticed more, at having trusted too easily. Others were more defensive, clinging to the image of the man they thought they knew, insisting that kindness could not coexist with cruelty. The jury listened, absorbing the contradictions, the way truth fractures under pressure. Experts testified next, careful and precise. Forensic analysts explained how microscopic traces survive, how contact leaves behind echoes that technology can now hear. They walked the jury through the DNA findings, emphasizing what they could say, and what they could not.
Partial profile.
Statistical significance. Probability rather than certainty. The defense seized on every caveat, every limitation, turning caution into doubt. They reminded the jury, again and again, of the years that had passed, of the risks inherent in revisiting old evidence, of the human tendency to reshape memory to fit new narratives. Then came the moment everyone had anticipated and dreaded in equal measure. The neighbor took the stand. He swore to tell the truth, his hand steady, his expression controlled. He spoke softly, deliberately, as if choosing each word with care. He described his relationship with Sarah as cordial, neighborly, nothing more. He denied any obsession, any conflict, any wrongdoing. When asked about the night she disappeared, he repeated the story he had told for years, his voice unwavering. He framed himself as another victim of circumstance, caught in a tragedy not of his making. Under cross-examination, the tone shifted. Prosecutors pressed him on specifics, on timing, on the decisions he'd made afterward. Why the sudden trip? Why the deep cleaning? Why the gaps in records? His answers grew more strained, explanations longer, less focused. He bristled when questioned about control, about his need to be involved, about his presence at vigils and searches. He insisted it was concern, nothing more. The jury watched closely, noting the tension beneath the surface, the way his jaw tightened when pressed, the way his eyes avoided certain questions altogether. As the days wore on, the weight of the story settled heavily over the room. Photographs of recovered items were shown, carefully, respectfully. The jewelry, the fragments, the confirmation that Sarah had not simply vanished, but had been taken, her life ended somewhere dark and forgotten. Her family sat together, holding on to one another, their faces etched with a grief that had aged them beyond their years. They listened as strangers spoke about their daughter, their sister, their aunt, reducing her to evidence while trying desperately to honor her humanity. Closing arguments arrived with a sense of inevitability. Prosecutors spoke of trust betrayed, of how the most dangerous threats are often the ones we invite inside without question. They asked the jury to consider not just each piece of evidence on its own, but the pattern they formed together, a pattern too consistent, too deliberate to be accidental. The defense countered with doubt, reminding jurors of the burden of proof, of the irreversible nature of their decision. They argued that suspicion is not guilt, that tragedy can distort perception, that the story presented was compelling but incomplete. When the jury retired to deliberate, the building exhaled. Hours stretched into days. Outside, cameras remained trained on the courthouse doors, commentators filling the silence with speculation. Inside, 12 people wrestled with the weight of nearly 2 decades of unanswered questions, aware that whatever they decided would ripple far beyond the room. The verdict, when it came, landed without theatrics.
Guilty.
The word echoed through the courtroom, sharp and final, cutting through years of uncertainty in a single breath. Sarah's family wept openly, a release of grief and vindication tangled together. The neighbor showed little reaction, his face set, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the walls, as if already retreating into a version of reality where this outcome had always been inevitable. Sentencing followed months later, the judge's words measured and grave. Life in prison. No possibility of parole. The sentence closed the legal chapter, but it did not restore what had been lost. Justice, in cases like this, is never clean. It arrives late, imperfect, carrying as much sorrow as relief. As the courtroom emptied and the cameras moved on, the community was left to reckon with the aftermath. The cold case had been solved, the headlines declared, but the deeper questions lingered, refusing to be contained by a verdict. How many signs had been missed? How easily trust had been given? How long the truth had waited, silent and patient, hidden behind a familiar face? And for those who had lived on that street, who had waved to the neighbor every morning, who had locked their doors a little tighter after Sarah disappeared, one realization settled in with chilling clarity. The danger they had feared from the outside had never come from beyond the neighborhood at all. It had been standing right beside them all along. The verdict did not bring silence. It brought a different kind of noise, one that lingered long after the courtroom doors closed and the cameras packed up. In living rooms across the neighborhood, television stayed on late into the night, replaying the same footage, the same phrases, the same grainy photos of a man no one recognized anymore, but everyone once knew.
Solved.
Closure. Justice served. The words sounded decisive, but they rang hollow against the low, persistent hum of disbelief. Because understanding what happened was not the same as understanding how it had been allowed to happen for so long. People began revisiting their own memories, not just of Sarah, but of themselves during those years. The choices they'd made. The instincts they'd ignored. The moments when something felt slightly off and was dismissed as nothing. A neighbor remembered the way he'd volunteered to walk her dog when she was sick, how grateful she'd been, how safe she'd felt. Another recalled lending him tools, standing side by side in the driveway, laughing about something trivial. These recollections, once warm and reassuring, now carried a sharp aftertaste, the realization that familiarity had acted as camouflage. Psychologists were brought onto talk shows, asked to explain how someone like that could hide in plain sight. They spoke of social trust, of how communities reward predictability and punish suspicion. They talked about the danger of equating politeness with safety, about how predators often cultivate normalcy as carefully as others cultivate gardens. The explanations were logical, measured, almost comforting in their structure. They did little to quiet the unease. Knowing the pattern didn't erase the fear that it could repeat. Sarah's family withdrew from the public eye after sentencing, their statements brief and controlled. They thanked law enforcement, thanked the jury, thanked those who had never forgotten. Privately, they faced a different reckoning. The truth had given them answers, but it had also given them images they could never unsee, details they would carry into every quiet moment. They planned a memorial near the place where she'd last felt safe, not because it felt right, but because it felt necessary, a way to reclaim a space that had been stolen from them. Investigators, too, struggled with the aftermath. Solving a cold case is often portrayed as triumph, but the reality is more complex. They reviewed the early days of the investigation with fresh eyes, asking what could have been done differently, what might have changed if technology or assumptions had been different. There were no easy conclusions, only lessons learned too late to help Sarah. Some took comfort in having finally spoken for her. Others felt the weight of the years she had spent missing, years that no verdict could give back. The neighbor's house remained empty for a long time, a quiet landmark no one wanted to claim. For sale signs came and went. Potential buyers drove past slowly, sensing the history clinging to the place even if they didn't know the details. Eventually, someone new would move in, repaint the walls, plant fresh flowers, unaware or unwilling to ask why certain neighbors avoided eye contact, why conversations hushed when they passed. Time would soften the edges, but it would not erase them. In the broader world, the case became a reference point, cited in articles and documentaries about cold cases and delayed justice. It was used to illustrate the power of persistence, of forensic advancement, of never giving up. Those narratives were not wrong, but they were incomplete. They rarely captured the quieter truth that solving the case had also exposed how fragile safety really is, how easily the structures we rely on can be manipulated. On the anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, a small group gathered again on the street, candles flickering in the humid air. There were no speeches this time, no reporters. Just silence, punctuated by the soft scrape of lighters and the sound of night insects. People stood together without touching, sharing a moment that felt less like remembrance and more like acknowledgement. This happened here. We live with it now. As the flames burned low, one thought passed unspoken among them, heavy and undeniable. The cold case had been solved, yes, but its echo would not fade. It would live on in the way doors were locked, in the way strangers were assessed, in the way trust was granted more slowly, more carefully. The story had ended in a courtroom, but its consequences had no such boundary. Because the most unsettling truth revealed by the case was not just who was responsible, but how ordinary the circumstances had been, how easily the line between safe and dangerous had blurred. And long after the headlines stopped printing, after the files were archived and the evidence stored away, that truth remained quiet and persistent, a reminder that sometimes the greatest mysteries are not about what we don't know, but about what we thought we did. Even after the story faded from the front pages, it refused to settle into the past. It lingered in smaller, quieter spaces, in the pauses between conversations, in the way people scanned a room before relaxing. The case had become a reference point, not just for law enforcement, but for the community's collective psyche, a marker dividing life into before and after. Before, when trust was automatic. After, when it had to be earned again, slowly, with caution that never fully slept. Law enforcement agencies across the state revisited their own unresolved files, inspired and unsettled by what had been uncovered in Texas. Training seminars cited the case as proof that persistence matters, that assumptions can be fatal, that familiarity should never be mistaken for innocence. Detectives listened, took notes, nodded. Many of them had their own cold cases tucked away, names and faces waiting for someone to look at them differently. Sarah Mitchell's story became a quiet challenge, a reminder that answers can hide not in distant shadows, but right at the center of the frame. For those who had known the neighbor personally, the reckoning was more intimate. They questioned their judgment, replayed moments that now felt contaminated by hindsight. Was that kindness genuine, or was it camouflage? Had they missed warning signs, or were there none to see? The mind searched desperately for certainty, for a clear line where trust should have ended. It rarely found one. That ambiguity was its own punishment, a realization that danger does not always announce itself with menace, that sometimes it blends seamlessly into routine. Sarah herself began to re-emerge in conversations, no longer just as a victim, but as a person flattened by years of speculation. Friends shared stories that hadn't made the news, memories that had nothing to do with her disappearance. Her laugh, her impatience with slow drivers, the way she sang along to the radio without realizing anyone could hear her. These fragments mattered now more than ever, an attempt to reclaim her from the narrative that had consumed her name. In remembering her fully, they resisted letting the crime define her entire existence. The legal finality of the verdict did little to quiet the philosophical questions the case raised. If the truth could hide for nearly 2 decades, what else remained buried? How many other lives had brushed past similar danger without knowing it? These questions surfaced in community meetings, in late-night discussions, in the uneasy fascination people felt when another cold case made the news. Each story carried the same undercurrent, the same uncomfortable possibility. It could happen here. It already did. In the prison where the neighbor would spend the rest of his life, the case followed him in a different way. He was processed, classified, absorbed into a system designed to erase individuality. The man who had once been known for his helpfulness became another file number, another body in a cell. There were no public statements, no last-minute revelations. Whatever he knew, whatever he felt, remained locked behind walls thicker than any courtroom silence. The absence of confession left a vacuum, a space where speculation continued to breathe. Investigators closed the file formally, signing off on a case that had defined portions of their careers. Some felt relief. Others felt an unexpected emptiness. The chase had ended, but the emotional investment did not evaporate so easily. They had lived with Sarah's story for years, carried it home with them, measured time by its slow progression. Letting go required its own adjustment, its own kind of mourning. As seasons turned and new stories replaced old ones, the neighborhood gradually resumed the rhythms of ordinary life. Children rode bikes down the street again. Lawns were mowed. Packages appeared on porches, unattended but watched a little more closely than before. Normalcy returned, but it was altered, layered with awareness. The illusion of safety had been replaced with something more fragile, more honest. And in that honesty, there was a strange kind of strength. People checked on each other more intentionally. Conversations went deeper, less superficial. The loss had carved out space for connection that hadn't existed before, a reminder that community is not just about proximity, but about vigilance, about caring enough to notice when something feels wrong. The cold case had been solved, but its lesson remained unresolved, echoing in subtle ways that no verdict could contain. It whispered a warning carried on the same Texas night air that had once held a sharp, metallic sound no one could quite remember anymore. A reminder that mystery does not always live in the dark. Sometimes it lives next door, waiting patiently, counting on time and trust to keep it hidden. By the time the 10th chapter of the story began to take shape, distance had softened the sharpest edges of shock, but not the meaning. Time had done what it always does. It dulled the noise, not the truth. The case now lived in a quieter register, discussed less often, but with more weight. It had become one of those stories people referenced in lowered voices, as if speaking too loudly might invite something similar back into their lives. For journalists who had covered the arrest, the cold case evolved from breaking news into a long-form reflection. Follow-up articles focused less on the crime itself and more on the failure points, misleads, overlooked behaviors, assumptions that went unchallenged. Editors framed it as a cautionary tale, a reminder that the absence of evidence is not the absence of guilt. Readers lingered over these pieces longer than expected, scrolling back up, rereading paragraphs that felt uncomfortably familiar. In police academies, the case became required study. Cadets examined timelines, dissected interviews, argued over decision-making in classrooms that smelled faintly of coffee and dry erase markers. Instructors emphasized one detail above all others: the suspect had never fit the profile investigators were trained to expect. He was too normal, too helpful, too embedded. The lesson was blunt and unsettling. Evil does not always arrive as an outsider. Sometimes it arrives with a smile and stays. The victim's family experienced a different kind of 10th chapter. With legal proceedings complete, the public attention finally receded, leaving behind a silence that felt both peaceful and heavy. There were no more microphones, no more calls from reporters. Just rooms filled with memories and the slow work of redefining life after resolution. Justice had arrived, but closure proved to be a far more complicated destination. Community leaders organized forums, not to rehash the crime, but to talk about prevention, awareness, and trust. Attendance was modest but sincere. People listened more than they spoke. The cold case had taught them that safety is not a guarantee, but a responsibility shared unevenly and imperfectly. These meetings didn't erase fear, but they reshaped it into something more actionable. Late at night, when the streets were empty and the houses dark, the neighborhood felt almost unchanged. And yet, for those who remembered, it never truly was. Every porch light, every passing car, carried a residue of what had been learned. That familiarity can deceive. That time can hide the truth, but not forever. The case had crossed a threshold, from mystery to memory, from headline to history. But its impact lingered in the smallest details, in the way people locked their doors, in the way they listened more carefully, in the way they questioned what they thought they knew about the people around them. This was no longer just a solved cold case. It was a warning preserved in narrative form, passed quietly from one person to another. Proof that even when justice arrives late, it arrives with consequences that ripple far beyond the courtroom, long after the final verdict has been read. In the final stretch of the story, there is no gavel striking wood, no clean emotional release, no sense that everything has been put back where it belongs. What remains instead is an afterimage, the kind that lingers when you stare too long at something bright and terrifying. Even with answers on paper, the case refuses to fully settle. It stays awake in the collective memory, restless, unresolved in ways that no court record can address. Years later, people still search the name online in the quiet hours of a night. Not out of curiosity alone, but out of a need to understand how something so close could go unnoticed for so long. Old interviews resurface. Grainy footage circulates again. Viewers pause on certain frames, rewinding, wondering if the truth was visible all along, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to look just a second longer. The house connected to the case stands unchanged, its walls absorbing new lives, new routines, new laughter. But for those who know the story, it carries a weight that can't be painted over. Neighbors pass by without stopping, without staring, yet with a subtle awareness that something irreversible once happened there. Places remember even when people try not to. Investigators who worked the files speak rarely about it now. When they do, it's not pride that comes through, but humility. They talk about instincts ignored, about trust misplaced, about the danger of certainty. The cold case didn't just expose a crime. It exposed the fragile architecture of belief that holds communities together and how easily it can crack. For the victim, time moves differently. Their name is spoken less often in the news, but more often in private. In moments that matter. At anniversaries. In conversations that end with silence instead of answers. They are no longer just a subject of investigation. They are a presence, felt rather than explained, a reminder of what was taken and what can never be fully returned. And so the story ends where it began, not with resolution, but with a question that refuses to fade. How many other truths are buried beneath familiarity? How many cold cases are not cold at all, just waiting behind closed doors, masked by routine, protected by trust? This case may be marked as solved in official records, but its shadow stretches far beyond that label. It lives on in caution, in doubt, in the uneasy knowledge that the most dangerous secrets are often kept closest to home. Long after the headlines stop, long after the cameras leave, the echo remains. Low. Persistent. Unfinished. There is a moment that comes even later, after the documentaries fade from recommendation lists and the podcasts move on to newer horrors, when the case becomes something else entirely. Not a headline, not a lesson, but a quiet reference point. A story people invoke when something feels off, when a smile lingers too long, when a neighbor knows too much. The name no longer shocks. It warns. In that way, the cold case never truly ends. It settles into the background noise of everyday life, subtle but persistent. A low hum beneath conversations about safety, about trust, about the thin line between normalcy and danger. Parents mention it without details. Officers remember it without files. Journalists recall it without notes.
It exists now as instinct.
Some nights, former investigators still replay interviews in their heads, not because they doubt the outcome, but because they wonder about the cost of the delay. They think about the years in between. The years where the truth sat across from them, unrecognized, unchallenged. They ask themselves whether justice delayed becomes something different entirely, whether time itself becomes an accomplice. The community carries its own version of that weight. Not guilt, exactly. Something more diffuse. A shared discomfort with how easily certainty once settled in. How quickly assumptions hardened into facts. Trust wasn't broken by the crime alone. It was fractured by the realization that everyone had participated in the illusion, simply by believing. New families move in. They hear the story secondhand, softened, abbreviated. They nod, they listen, they move on. But the older residents know better. They know that stories like this don't fade. They sink. They become part of the ground. You don't see them anymore, but they shape everything built on top. And somewhere within all of this, the victim remains the fixed point. Not frozen in time, but carried forward through every retelling, every warning, every uneasy pause. Their absence is the only constant. Proof that the cost of silence is never abstract. It has a name. It has a history. It has a space that will never be filled. So when people ask why these stories are told again and again, why cold cases are reopened, revisited, re-examined, the answer is never just about resolution. It's about vigilance, about memory, about refusing to let familiarity become a blindfold. Because this case, like so many others, teaches a final, uncomfortable truth. That the most haunting mysteries are not the ones without answers, but the ones where the answer was always there, waiting patiently, hiding behind a face everyone trusted, until time ran out. By the 13th movement of this narrative, the story has thinned into something almost invisible, and that is where it becomes most dangerous. No sirens. No tape. No urgent updates. Just the residue of a truth that refuses to dissolve. The case is cited less, but it is felt more, embedded in habits, in pauses, in the way people choose their words when they talk about trust. Years have passed, enough for the calendar to insist on distance, but distance never meant disappearance. The file is archived, the evidence boxed, the courtroom emptied. Yet the emotional geometry remains unchanged. Lines drawn long ago still intersect in unexpected ways. A glance exchanged at a town meeting. A door locked twice instead of once. A silence that stretches just a second longer than it should. Those who lived through it understand that the real aftermath doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as common sense. It shows up when someone decides not to ignore a small inconsistency. When a routine feels slightly wrong and is questioned instead of dismissed. The cold case did not just close a chapter. It rewired perception. There is no monument for this kind of ending. No plaque to explain what was learned. The lesson survives only if it is remembered, and memory is fragile. It depends on stories told carefully, without spectacle, without comfort. Stories that resist the urge to simplify. Because this was never a simple crime. It was a slow erosion of certainty, a long demonstration of how easily the familiar can camouflage the unthinkable. The victim's name still surfaces, not loudly, not often, but with intention. In classrooms. In training rooms. In conversations between people who want to believe the world is predictable, but know better now. Their life has become a reference point, not as a symbol, but as a warning etched into collective awareness. And so the voice lowers, not because the story is over, but because it has reached the place where stories live the longest. Not in headlines, not in verdicts, but in the quiet decisions made every day. To look again. To ask once more. To doubt what seems too easy. This is how cold cases truly end. Not with certainty, but with vigilance. Not with relief, but with resolve. The mystery may be labeled solved, the neighbor unmasked, the truth recorded in ink. But the echo remains, steady and unforgiving, reminding anyone who listens that time does not erase danger, it only disguises it. And somewhere, beneath the ordinary sounds of life continuing, the story keeps breathing, waiting, not to shock again, but to be remembered. By the 14th turn of this voice, the story has fully slipped out of chronology and into something deeper, something harder to define. It is no longer anchored to dates or evidence logs. It exists as an undercurrent, a presence. The kind of story that doesn't need to be told straight through anymore, because everyone who knows it carries their own fragment, their own angle, their own quiet interpretation of what it all meant. In Texas, the year 2005 has become shorthand. Not spoken with detail, not explained to outsiders. Just referenced. A look, a pause, a change in tone. The cold case no longer belongs to investigators or reporters. It belongs to the space between people, to the invisible adjustments made after trust has been proven fragile. Doors are still opened. Smiles are still exchanged. But belief is no longer automatic. What unsettles most is not what was done, but how long it took to see it. The crime itself was violent, yes, but the true shock came later, when familiarity was exposed as camouflage. When the idea of knowing someone collapsed under scrutiny. That realization didn't fade with time. It sharpened. It matured. It settled into the collective consciousness like a permanent bruise. There are moments when the story resurfaces unexpectedly. A new cold case breaks elsewhere. A neighbor is arrested in another state. A headline flashes across a screen, eerily familiar. And suddenly this case is back, not as news, but as comparison. As proof that these stories don't belong to one place, 1 year, one mistake. They are patterns. And patterns repeat. Those who lived closest to it learned a difficult discipline. Suspicion without paranoia, awareness without fear. It is a delicate balance, and not everyone manages it. Some retreat inward. Some become hypervigilant. Others pretend nothing changed at all. But beneath each response lies the same understanding. Normality is not evidence. kindness is not immunity. Trust is not protection. The cold case solved something factual, but it opened something philosophical. It forced a question that never fully resolves itself. How well can anyone truly know another person? The answer is uncomfortable, and that discomfort is precisely why the case still matters. So the voice continues, softer now, not because the danger is gone, but because the lesson has been absorbed. This is no longer a story meant to shock. It is a story meant to stay, to linger in the background of everyday life, shaping instincts, influencing choices, whispering warnings that don't need to be loud to be heard. And as the narrative drifts further from the crime itself, it moves closer to its lasting truth. That the most enduring impact of a cold case is not the resolution, but the permanent alteration of how a community understands itself. By the 15th passage, the story has worn itself smooth, like a stone turned over endlessly in the hand. Not erased, not diminished, but changed by repetition and reflection. What once cut sharply now presses steadily. The cold case no longer demands attention, it commands respect. It has earned its place as something that cannot be hurried past. In conversations that drift late into the night, the case is mentioned without names, without details, as if specifics might cheapen what was learned. People talk instead about moments, about instincts they ignored, about questions they didn't ask because politeness felt safer than doubt. The crime becomes secondary to the reckoning. The violence is remembered, but the vulnerability is what stays. Those who study these cases professionally understand this phase well. It's when analysis gives way to philosophy, when timelines and evidence fade, replaced by patterns of human behavior that repeat across jurisdictions and decades. The Texas case slots neatly into that grim lineage, another data point in the uncomfortable truth that danger rarely announces itself. It blends in. It adapts. It waits. There is a particular unease reserved for crimes that grow in familiarity before they are understood. They force a reevaluation not just of one person, but of an entire environment. Every interaction becomes retroactive. Every memory is reinterpreted through a darker lens. Laughter recalled now feels misplaced. Trust, once extended, feels naive. The past itself becomes suspect. And yet, life continues. It always does. Children grow up unaware of the weight carried by certain addresses. New routines overwrite old ones. Time insists on forward motion, even when understanding lags behind. The cold case survives this movement not by resisting it, but by embedding itself within it, influencing without interrupting. There is no final moral delivered neatly at this stage. No lesson underlined in bold. The story has moved beyond instruction. It has become atmosphere. A quiet pressure that shapes decisions without demanding explanation. People lock doors. People listen more closely. People hesitate when something feels just slightly off, and that hesitation is the true legacy. The 15th movement does not seek to remind the listener of what happened. It assumes that memory is already secure. Instead, it asks something more difficult. What happens next? Not in the case, but in the lives that absorbed it. How does a community carry knowledge without being crushed by it? How does it remain open without being blind? The answer is never spoken outright. It unfolds slowly, imperfectly, through choices made in silence, through caution learned the hard way, through an understanding that some stories don't end because their purpose is not to conclude, but to endure. And so the voice continues, steady and restrained, not chasing shock, not seeking closure, just bearing witness to the long tail of consequence that follows a cold case long after the last headline fades. By the 16th movement, the story has slipped entirely into the realm of inheritance. Not something actively recalled, but something passed down. Attention transferred quietly from one generation to the next, like a habit learned without explanation. Those who are too young to remember the crime itself still feel its shape, even if they don't know its name. In subtle ways, the case rewrote the local definition of safe. It changed how people interpret silence, how they weigh familiarity, how quickly they dismiss unease. What once would have been brushed aside as coincidence now earns a second look. Not because paranoia took root, but because memory did. A disciplined memory. One that refuses to forget the cost of assumption. The neighbor at the center of the case has long since been removed from daily conversation, but not from consequence. His absence is louder than his presence ever was. A reminder that trust, once broken so completely, leaves a vacuum that can't be refilled with reassurance alone. The community learned that knowing someone's routine is not the same as knowing their nature. This is where the cold case becomes less about crime and more about human limitation. About the gaps between what we see and what is real. About the danger of believing that evil must look unfamiliar to be recognizable. The lesson is not dramatic. It is exhausting. It requires constant attention, constant humility, constant willingness to admit uncertainty. For those who investigate such cases for a living, this phase is the most sobering. It's where victory feels incomplete, where answers exist but satisfaction does not. Solving the case did not restore what was lost. It only clarified how long it had been missing. Justice arrived, but it arrived late, and lateness carries its own weight. The victim's story continues to circulate quietly, stripped of spectacle, reduced to its essential truth. A life interrupted. A warning delivered too slowly. Their memory no longer belongs to outrage or grief alone, but to vigilance. To the idea that paying attention is not optional, but necessary. And so the narrative presses on, no longer driven by shock or mystery, but by consequence. This is the part no one prepares for. The long aftermath. The years where nothing happens, yet everything has changed. Where the danger is gone, but the awareness remains. The cold case may be filed away, but its influence is active, shaping instincts, sharpening perception, reminding anyone who listens closely that the most important moments are often the quiet ones, the ones where nothing seems wrong until it is. This is not an ending. It is a condition. One learned slowly, painfully, and carried forward without ceremony.